The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the great hall, crept up through the thin soles of her slippers, and settled deep in her bones. Alara had been born to the frost, a child of the northern packs, but the chill she felt had little to do with the weather. It was a coldness that came from within, a permanent winter of the soul. She was an absence of color in a world of vibrant warmth. Her hair, a fall of stark white. Her skin, the pale shade of milk. Her eyes, a faint pinkish red that made others flinch away, whispering of curses and bad omens. They called her the ghost wolf, the albino, the unclaimed. Her father, Alpha Valerius, had made sure the last name stuck. On her 10th birthday, when her otherness had become a political inconvenience, he had held her down himself. The scent of burning iron and her own skin had filled the air as he pressed the searing brand into the delicate flesh of her inner wrist. A circle broken by a jagged line. The mark of the defective, the cursed. Now, years later, she stood at the very back of the great hall, hidden in the shadows as much as a creature of pure white could be. The annual claiming ceremony was a spectacle of hope and ambition for the other she-wolves. For Alara, it was an exercise in humiliation. She was required to attend by pack law, a living cautionary tale for the others. This is what happens when you are flawed. The air was thick with the scent of pine from the roaring hearths, roasted meats that made her stomach ache with hunger, and the cloying perfumes of dozens of hopeful females. They were dressed in rich velvets and furs, their hair intricately braided with silver clasps. Ilara wore a plain gray wool dress, its rough texture a constant reminder of her station. It was the best she owned. She kept her left hand tucked away, the sleeve pulled down over the ugly puckered scar on her wrist. But she could always feel it, a phantom itch, a brand on her very worth. Whispers followed her like shadows. "Look, the ghost is here. My mother said to not even look in her direction. It brings bad luck." Pathetic. No wolf would claim something so broken. Each word was a small, sharp stone thrown against the fragile walls she had built around her heart. She focused on a loose thread on her sleeve, twisting it between her fingers. She had learned long ago that invisibility was her only shield. If she stayed quiet enough, still enough, sometimes people forgot she was there. Her father stood near the Alpha Dais, laughing with other powerful leaders. He was a handsome man, his dark hair streaked with silver, his presence commanding. He had not looked at her once. To him, she was not a daughter. She was a stain on his legacy, a failure he was forced to endure. A hush fell over the hall, sudden and absolute. The laughter died, the whispers ceased. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to dim. The great oaken doors at the far end of the hall swung inward, pushed by two guards in black iron armor. A wave of cold, far more profound than the ambient chill, washed over the room. It was a cold that carried weight, a cold that tasted of ancient ice and absolute power. He entered. King Theron, the White Alpha. He was a myth made real, a being of legend who ruled the entire northern continent from his frozen citadel. They said he was centuries old, that his heart was a shard of ice, that he had never taken a mate because no female was strong enough to withstand his chilling presence. He was larger than any wolf she had ever seen, his shoulders a testament to raw power, his every movement a study in predatory grace. His hair was the color of a winter storm cloud, dark and shot through with silver. But it was his eyes that held the hall captive. They were the color of a frozen lake, a pale, piercing ice blue that seemed to see everything, to strip away all pretense and lay souls bare. He moved with a silence that was more terrifying than any roar. The assembled alphas, her father included, bowed their heads in deference. He was not just a king, he was the apex of their kind. His gaze swept the room, dismissive and cold. It passed over the lines of beautiful, preening she-wolves, their hopeful faces falling under the frost of his indifference. He was not looking for beauty. He was not looking for strength. He was searching. Alara pressed herself further into the shadows, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She wished she could melt into the stone. Disappear. This was a predator of a kind she could barely comprehend, and she was a broken thing. Prey. His eyes kept moving. Past the daughters of powerful alphas, past the famed warriors, past the celebrated beauties. His search was relentless, methodical. And then, his eyes stopped. They found her. They locked onto her from across the vast hall. For a heartbeat, the world ceased to exist. Was a look of recognition, as if he had was a look of recognition, as if he had been searching for her face in a crowd for 100 years. Panic seized her. She tried to look away, to break the connection, but she was trapped. He began to walk, not toward the dais, not toward the alphas. He walked toward her. The crowd parted before him like the sea before a god. A path cleared from the center of the hall directly to the dark corner where she trembled. The whispers erupted again, no longer hushed, but sharp with shock and disbelief. What is he doing? He's going for her? Impossible. Her father's face was a mask of thunderous confusion. This was not part of his world, not a variable he could have ever calculated. Alara's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the floor. He stopped a pace from her, and the sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. He smelled of pine needles after a frost, of cold stone and something else, something uniquely his, something ancient and lonely. She could not meet his eyes. She stared at the polished black leather of his boots. A large hand encased in a black glove reached for her. She flinched, expecting a blow, a dismissal, a shove. It was a reflex born of a lifetime of casual cruelty. His hand stopped, hovering in the air for a moment. Then, with a gentleness that was utterly at odds with his terrifying reputation, he took her left hand. He turned it over, his thumb brushing against the sleeve of her dress. He pushed the rough wool back. He exposed her brand to the entire hall. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Shame, hot and sharp, flooded Alara's veins. He was going to denounce her, to make an example of her, to show everyone what happened to the cursed and the broken. Mark of her shame. He lowered his head. Mark of her shame. He lowered his head, and the scent of her skin filled his senses. A sharp, clean scent of snow and winter roses, a scent that cut through the centuries of ice and solitude. He knew. This was her. The one the prophecy had spoken of, the one he had been searching for. He looked up from her brand, his ice-blue eyes finally meeting hers. And in their depths, she saw not coldness, but a storm of emotions too complex for her to name. Longing, pain, and a sliver of something that looked impossibly like hope. Then he did the unthinkable. King Theron, the White Alpha, the most powerful being in their world, knelt. He went down on one knee before her, the albino outcast, the branded girl. He bowed his head, a gesture of ultimate fealty, of absolute submission. The silence in the hall was no longer respectful. It was shattered, broken. He lifted his gaze to hers, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor, meant for her ears alone but heard by all in the stunned quiet. I have found you. The citadel was a fortress of ice and shadow, carved from the peak of a mountain that pierced the clouds. It was beautiful in the way a glacier was beautiful, vast, merciless, and ancient. Towers of black rock were laced with veins of permanent glowing blue ice. A biting wind howled constantly around its ramparts, a lonely song that echoed the emptiness Alara felt inside. King Theron had not spoken another word to her after his shocking declaration. He had simply risen, taken her hand, and led her from the great hall, leaving behind a maelstrom of confusion and outrage. Her father's face had been a terrifying canvas of fury and disbelief. Alara had not dared to look back. Now, she stood in a suite of rooms larger than her father's entire longhouse. A fire roared in a hearth carved from a single block of obsidian. The bed was draped in white furs so soft they felt like clouds. A wardrobe stood open, filled with gowns of silk and velvet in shades of silver, white, and midnight blue. It was a gilded cage. He had left her here with a quiet servant who had shown her the bath, a steaming pool fed by a hot spring deep within the mountain, and then vanished. She felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. She touched nothing. She sat on the edge of a velvet chaise, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the rough wool of her old dress a familiar anchor in this sea of opulence. What did he want with her? Why perform such a public spectacle? It made no sense. He was the king. He could have any she-wolf he desired. Why choose the one everyone agreed was worthless? The doors to her chamber opened without a sound. He was there, a towering silhouette against the flickering firelight. He had removed his gloves and heavy outer cloak. He wore a simple black tunic that did little to hide the formidable strength of his frame. His hands were bare. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with a network of faint blue veins visible beneath the surface. They looked cold to the touch. "You are not comfortable," he stated. It was not a question. Alara jumped to her feet, her head bowed. "Your Majesty." "Look at me," he commanded. His voice was not harsh, but it held an undeniable weight of authority. Slowly, she lifted her head. His ice-blue eyes studied her, and she felt that same unnerving sense of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. "This is your home now, Alara. You may be comfortable in it." He knew her name. The thought sent a strange flutter through her chest. No one but the servants ever used her name. To her father, she was the girl. To the pack, the albino. Why? The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. A desperate, whispered plea. "Why me?" He moved closer, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He stopped a few feet away, a safe distance. "I have my reasons. They are reasons of state. A political arrangement." The thought was a cold comfort. It made a sort of brutal sense. Perhaps her cursed status offered him some kind of advantage she couldn't comprehend. "There are conditions to our arrangement," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You will be my queen. You will have every comfort, every protection. You will want for nothing." He paused, and the silence stretched, heavy with unspoken things. "But you will not have me." The words landed like chips of ice against her skin. "I cannot offer you warmth," he said, his gaze flicking to the fire as if the very concept were foreign to him. "I cannot offer you affection. My chambers are in the northern spire. Yours are here. We will dine together when required by protocol. We will appear together in court. Outside of that, we will lead separate lives." It was a dismissal, a politely worded rejection that still managed to cut deep. He had chosen her, only to cast her aside. The familiar ache of worthlessness returned with a vengeance. Of course. This was all she was good for. A symbol, a political piece on a board she didn't understand. "I understand, Your Majesty," she whispered, her eyes finding the floor again. "There is one more thing," he said, his tone turning grave. "You must never touch me." Her head snapped up. "My touch is not safe," he said, the words costing him something. "Cold in my blood, a curse of my line. It cold in my blood, a curse of my line. It is a danger to others." He was broken too. The thought was a shock. This magnificent, powerful creature was flawed. In a way, it made him seem less like a god and more like a man. A very lonely, very cold man. "I chose you, Alara," he said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper, "because I hoped that you, of all people, might understand that a woman branded for a curse might not be harmed by another's." It was a lie. She felt it instinctively. A convenient story to explain the inexplicable. But it was the only explanation he was willing to give, and she was in no position to question it. "I will do as you ask," she said quietly. He gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. Good. The servants will see to your... Good. The servants will see to your needs." He turned and left as silently as he had come, the heavy doors closing behind him with a soft click, sealing her inside her luxurious prison. Days bled into a week. Alara lived in a state of suspended reality. She wore the beautiful gowns, ate the exquisite food brought to her chambers, and stared out the arched windows at the endless vista of snow-capped peaks. She was a queen in name, a prisoner in truth. She saw Theron only at the evening meal, held in a vast echoing dining hall. They sat at opposite ends of a long polished table, the distance between them a yawning chasm. The silence was their only companion. He ate little, his movements precise and controlled. He would watch her sometimes, his gaze intense and searching, but whenever she met his eyes, he would immediately look away. The boundary he had set was absolute. And yet, small things began to happen. One evening she shivered, the chill of the hall seeping into her thin silk gown. The next morning, a magnificent cloak of white wolf fur, impossibly soft and warm, was lying on her bed. There was no note. She mentioned to a servant that the bread reminded her of the honey cakes her mother used to bake before she had passed. From then on, a small plate of warm honey cakes appeared with her breakfast every day. He was watching her, listening, caring for her from a distance, through proxies. These small, anonymous gestures of kindness were more intimate than any conversation. They were cracks in the wall of ice he had built around himself. One night, she couldn't sleep. The howling of the wind felt like a lament, and her own loneliness was a physical ache in her chest. Drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, she left her rooms and wandered the silent, moonlit corridors of the citadel. The castle was a labyrinth of black stone and glowing ice. She walked for what felt like miles, her bare feet silent on the cold floors. She found herself in a section of the castle that felt older, colder. The northern spire. His domain. A heavy, iron-bound door stood slightly ajar at the end of a long hallway. A faint blue light pulsed from within, and a cold so intense it made her teeth ache poured from the opening. Curiosity, stronger than her fear, pulled her forward. She peeked inside. The room was not a bedchamber. It was a cavern of ice. The walls, floor, and ceiling were coated in a thick layer of crystalline frost. In the center of the room, on a dais of black stone, was what looked like a sarcophagus made of solid, clear ice. And he was inside it. Theron lay within the ice, perfectly still, his eyes closed. He was not sleeping. He was encased. The faint blue light emanated from his chest, pulsing in a slow, rhythmic beat, like a dying heart. The black, vein-like patterns of a creeping frost covered his torso, stark against his pale skin. This was his curse, not just a coldness in his blood, but a living, growing winter that was consuming him from the inside out. He didn't just live in the cold, he was being devoured by it. A gasp escaped her lips, a tiny sound in the profound silence. His eyes snapped open. They glowed with that same pale blue light. He saw her. He was trapped, frozen, yet he saw her. Panic and shame warred within her. She had violated his privacy, seen the one thing he had tried so desperately to hide, his ultimate vulnerability. She fled. her heart hammering against her ribs. She ran back through the frozen corridors. The image of him entombed in ice burned into her mind. She didn't just see a king that night. She saw a man in agony, fighting a losing battle against the monster within him. And in that moment, her fear of him vanished, replaced by a sudden, fierce, and utterly terrifying wave of compassion. She was beginning to see past his mask, and what she saw was breaking her heart. The next evening at dinner, the silence was different. "It was nowhere in the North Spire," he said. "His were in the North Spire," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. It was not an accusation, it was a statement of fact. Ilara's head remained bowed. I am sorry I was lost." "Do not lie to me, Ilara," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Not you." She looked up. The coldness in his eyes was still there, but beneath it she saw exhaustion, a weariness that seemed centuries old. "I saw you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "In the ice." He did not deny it. He simply inclined his head. "The curse demands its price. It slows the decay. It keeps the cold contained." "It's killing you," she said, the words torn from her. "It has been killing me for 300 years, he replied, his voice flat. "I am merely accustomed to it." "Why?" she asked again, but this time the question was different. Not why me, but why this? What is this curse? He looked away, his jaw tight. "It is the legacy of my bloodline. My ancestor made a pact with a winter goddess for power. The power to unite the packs, to build this kingdom. The price was that our hearts would be frozen. We could rule, we could conquer, we could not love. For any of my line, to find their true mate, to feel love, it turns our own power against us. The cold inside awakens and consumes us. Love will kill me." The confession hung in the air between them, more chilling than any winter wind. Now she understood. He had brought her here, his mate, and kept her at a distance not just to protect her from his touch, but to protect himself from his feelings for her. The small kindnesses, the stolen glances, each one was a risk. Each one was another step toward his own death. "Then why?" she choked out, her heart aching for him. "Why bring me here at all? Why not leave me to my fate? It would have been safer for you." "Because I have been alone for centuries," he said, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that shattered her. "And for the first time, I did not wish to be. It was a selfish choice, a foolish one." He met her gaze, his own eyes a swirling tempest of pain. "And I fear it will be the end of me." A summons arrived, bearing the sigil of her father, a snarling wolf's head. Alpha Valerius was coming to the citadel. He demanded an audience with the king to discuss the impropriety of his union with a defective. Ilara's blood ran cold. The thought of facing him again, especially here, in this fragile new existence, was terrifying. He was the architect of all her pain, the source of the brand on her soul. Theron saw the fear in her eyes when he told her. "You do not have to see him," he said immediately. "I will handle this." "No," Ilara found herself saying, the word surprising her with its firmness. "He is my father. This is my shame. I will not hide from him." She would not be a frightened child any longer. Standing beside Theron, even at a distance, had given her a sliver of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Valerius arrived with a retinue of his biggest, most brutish warriors. He strode into the throne room as if he owned it, his arrogance a palpable force. The throne room was a cavernous space, Theron's throne carved from the same black stone as the mountain, a single, massive shard of glowing ice embedded behind it. Theron sat on the throne, a figure of imposing stillness. Ilara stood a few steps below him, to his right. She wore a simple silver gown, her white hair a stark contrast to the dark stone. She felt Theron's presence behind her like a shield. "King Theron," Valerius began, his voice booming with false deference. "I come as a concerned father and a loyal alpha. You have made a grave error." "Have I?" Theron's voice was dangerously quiet, colder than the ice behind him. "You have taken my daughter," Valerius said, gesturing toward Alara as if she were a piece of property. "The girl is cursed, branded. She is defective, an ill omen. Her presence here will bring ruin to your kingdom. The packs are already whispering. They say the White Alpha has lost his mind." Alara flinched at the word defective, the old wound tearing open. She could feel the stares of her father's guards, filled with contempt and pity. "The packs whisper what you tell them to whisper, Valerius," Theron said, his eyes narrowing. "And I am not concerned with the opinions of lesser alphas." Valerius's face flushed with anger. "She is pack property. She belongs to us. I demand you return her. We will deal with her accordingly." Deal with her. The words promised a fate worse than the one she had already endured. "She belongs to me," Theron stated, the words ringing with absolute finality. "She is my queen." "She is a curse!" Valerius roared, his control finally snapping. He took a step forward, his hand pointing a trembling finger at Alara. "I marked her myself. I branded her to contain the bad blood she carries, to protect my pack from her foul luck." "You branded your own daughter?" Theron's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to creep across the floor from the base of his throne. "You tortured a child?" "I did what was necessary," Valerius spat, emboldened by his own rage. "A seer told me when she was born. She told me the girl carried a dangerous anomaly in her blood, a wild, unpredictable power. A power that could unravel everything. I did it to break her, to ensure that power would never surface. She wasn't cursed, you fool. She was a threat." The world tilted on its axis. It was all a lie. Her entire life. The shame, the whispers, the worthlessness. It wasn't because she was an ill omen. It was because he was afraid of her. He hadn't branded her because she was weak. He had branded her because he feared she was strong. A power inside her. The idea was so foreign, so impossible, it barely registered. Theron rose slowly from his throne. He was no longer a king. He was a force of nature, an ancient predatory power unleashed. "You broke her," he growled, the sound vibrating in Alara's bones. "You took something precious and tried to destroy it because you were afraid." Rage, pure and hot, surged through Alara, not for herself, but for the little girl who had been held down, who had believed she was worthless for so long. And a different kind of rage, a protective fury, for Theron. Valerius was threatening the one person who had ever shown her a sliver of kindness. As Theron's fury mounted, Alara saw it. A black line, thin as a spider's thread, crept up from the collar of his tunic onto his neck. The curse. His emotion, his rage on her behalf was feeding it. It was making him worse. "Stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. Theron's ice-blue eyes, now glowing with a terrifying light, flickered to her. He saw the direction of her gaze, saw the black vein on his own skin. He understood. His fury for her was killing him. Saw the weakness. A cruel, triumphant saw the weakness. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. So, the legend has a flaw after all. The girl truly is a curse. She is unmaking you. "Get out!" Theron snarled, his voice strained. "Get out of my sight before I tear you limb from limb." "I will be back," Valerius promised, his eyes gleaming with newfound ambition. "When your kingdom is ready for a real alpha, one who is not weakened by a worthless half-breed." He turned and swept from the room, his guards following in his wake. The moment they were gone, Theron collapsed. He fell to one knee, his body racked with tremors. The frost that had been creeping across the floor now raced toward him, swirling around his legs. "Theron!" Alara cried, rushing to his side, forgetting his warning not to touch him. She reached for him, but he threw up a hand to stop her. "No, stay back," he gritted out, his face pale and beaded with sweat, a sheen of ice already forming on his brow. "It's worse now. Much worse." The emotional confrontation had accelerated the curse. His love for her, expressed as protective rage, had been like gasoline on a fire. He was freezing from the inside out, and this time it was happening faster than ever before. He forced himself to his feet, swaying. "I must go," he rasped, "to the chamber. It is the only way." He turned and staggered from the throne room, leaving a trail of frost in his wake. Alara watched him go, her heart a block of ice in her own chest. Her father hadn't just revealed a secret. He had handed Theron a death sentence. The cold from the north spire became a palpable entity. It was no longer confined to his chamber. It bled out into the corridors, coating the walls in a thick rime of frost. The servants, their faces grim, avoided that wing of the citadel entirely. The castle itself seemed to be mourning. Theron had locked himself away. The great iron-bound door was sealed not by a lock, but by a wall of solid ice, thick and impenetrable. He had shut her out completely. For 2 days, Alara paced outside the frozen door, her hands raw from pressing them against the unyielding cold. She called his name until her voice was hoarse. There was no reply. Through their fragile, nascent bond, she could feel him. It was a thread of pure agony, a fading ember of warmth in an encroaching blizzard. He was losing. The ice was winning. On the 3rd day, a tremor of finality shuddered through that bond. It was a feeling of surrender, of letting go. He was dying. He was choosing to die alone in the dark and the cold to keep her safe, to prevent the curse from fully taking him and perhaps lashing out. "No," she whispered to the frozen door. "I will not let you." She refused to leave. She brought furs from her room and camped outside his chamber, a lonely vigil in the frozen hallway. The cold was brutal. It sank into her bones, making her shiver uncontrollably. But she did not move. If he was going to die, he would not die alone. A quiet servant, an old woman with kind eyes named Lyra, brought her broth and warm bread. "My queen, you will freeze," she pleaded. "Then I will freeze," Alara replied, her gaze never leaving the door. "I am not leaving him." She talked to him through the ice, her voice a low murmur. She told him about her mother, about the small joys of her childhood before her father's cruelty had extinguished them. She told him about the first time she saw him, how his eyes had not held disgust, but something else. She told him he was not a monster, that the cold was not who he was. She poured out her heart to a wall of ice, hoping some small piece of her warmth could reach the man entombed within. On the 4th day, the bond grew faint, so thin and fragile she could barely feel it. Despair, thick and suffocating, settled over her. She was losing him. It was then that the alarms rang. Shouts echoed from the main halls, the clash of steel. Valerius had returned. He hadn't waited for Theron to die. He had come to seize the throne, to finish the job. Lyra rushed to her side, her face pale with terror. "My queen, they've breached the gates. Alpha Valerius is here. You must hide." Alara got to her feet, a strange calm settling over her. Hiding was what the old Alara would have done. She was not that person anymore. The man she loved was dying behind that door. Her father was not going to touch him. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am not hiding." She walked from the frozen corridor toward the sounds of battle, her silver gown trailing behind her. She moved with a purpose she had never felt before. She found her father in the throne room. He had already dispatched the few royal guards who had stood against him. He stood with his foot on the chest of Theron's captain, a bloody sword in his hand. Daughter. He sneered, his eyes lighting up with cruel victory when he saw her. Come to welcome your new king? You are not a king, Ilara said, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. You are a coward and a murderer. Valerius laughed. Brave words from a broken thing. The White Alpha is dead or dying. His power fades. This citadel is mine. And you, he said, stalking toward her, are mine to dispose of. His guards moved to flank her, to grab her. Don't touch her, a voice growled. It was the captain, bruised and bleeding on the floor, but still trying to protect his queen. Valerius kicked him viciously in the ribs. Silence, dog. Seeing the senseless cruelty, seeing the good man injured for her sake, watching her father stand there gloating while Theron faded away upstairs, something inside Ilara snapped. A dam broke. It was not a conscious thought. It was a primal, instinctual roar of pure protective rage, a desperate, soul-deep refusal to accept this reality. He would not take Theron from her. He would not win. As Valerius's guards reached for her arms, a wave of energy erupted from her body. It was not cold. It was warmth. A blinding, brilliant wave of golden light that threw the guards back, sending them sprawling across the floor. The entire throne room was flooded with a light like the dawn. It poured from Ilara, from her skin, her hair, her eyes. The brand on her wrist glowed with a fiery intensity, the dark, scarred lines turning to molten gold. Valerius stared, his face a mask of pure terror. The seer had been right. The power he had tried to crush for 2 decades was real, and it was magnificent. What are you? He stammered, stumbling backward. Ilara didn't answer. She had only one thought: Theron. She turned and ran from the throne room, the golden light trailing behind her like a cloak. She flew up the stairs, back to the frozen corridor. She didn't slow as she approached the door. She slammed her hands against the wall of ice. The moment her palms made contact, the golden energy surged from her, a torrent of pure life. The ice didn't just melt, it vaporized. A huge section of the door hissed into steam, vanishing in an instant, leaving a gaping hole. She scrambled through it, into the heart of the cold. The chamber was worse than before. The ice was no longer clear blue, but a sickly, dead black. Theron was completely encased, his skin gray, his lips blue. The black, frosty veins of the curse covered his entire body. There was no light in his chest, no pulse in their bond. He was gone. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of pure animal grief. No. She climbed onto the stone dais, ignoring the searing cold that bit at her skin, a cold that felt like death itself. She placed her hands on the black ice over his heart. I refuse to let you go, she whispered, tears streaming down her face, freezing on her cheeks. You are not allowed to die. I love you. She said the words that were supposed to be his death sentence, but as she spoke them, a final, defiant surge of power erupted from her. It was not just warmth, it was life. It was the antithesis of his curse. It poured from her hands into the ice, into him. The brand on her wrist flared one last time, so brightly it was impossible to look at. The scarred flesh beneath it healed, smoothed over, leaving no trace it had ever been there. The false curse was burned away by her true power, her power to heal, to restore, to love without limit. The black ice around Theron began to crack. The cracks spread, glowing with golden light from within. With a sound like a mountain breaking apart, the entire sarcophagus of black ice shattered, exploding outward in a shower of glittering dust. Theron lay on the stone, free. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his chest rising and falling for the first time in days. Color flooded back into his skin, the deathly gray replaced by the pale tone of life. The black, vein-like marks of the curse receded, vanishing as if they had never been. His eyes fluttered open. They were no longer the color of ice. The piercing blue was gone, replaced by a soft, warm silver, like the sky after a storm. The chill was gone. He looked at her, his gaze clear and full of a wonder that mirrored her own. He reached up, his hand no longer cold, and cupped her cheek. His touch was warm, solid, real. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice rough but whole. "I thought I lost you," she sobbed, collapsing against his chest, her power spent, leaving her weak and trembling. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. It was the first time they had ever truly touched. It was not dangerous. It was not cold. It was like coming home. "You saved me," he murmured into her hair. "The curse. It's gone. I can't feel it anymore." He pulled back slightly to look at her. His silver eyes filled with an emotion so profound it stole her breath. "You are not a curse. You are the cure. You were always the cure." The truth of it settled over them. His bloodline was not doomed to be loveless. Her power was not a threat to be extinguished. They were two halves of a whole, his curse and her cure, destined to find and heal one another. He leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of gratitude and relief, of centuries of loneliness finally ending. It was a promise, a beginning. When they finally broke apart, the sound of booted feet approaching the chamber made them turn. Valerius stood in the now open doorway, his sword dangling from his hand, his face a picture of utter disbelief. Theron rose to his feet, pulling Ilara up with him. He was no longer the dying king. He stood tall and straight, his power radiating from him not as a chilling force but as a steady, formidable strength. "Valerius," Theron said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "You came to claim my throne." Her father, seeing the living, breathing, and very much healed king, dropped his sword with a clatter. "At the cowering Alpha." "You will be taken at the cowering Alpha. You will be taken to the dungeons, and you will have a very long time in the cold and the dark to reflect on what it means to harm a queen." The royal guards, now recovered, swarmed into the room and hauled the sputtering, protesting Valerius away. Alone again, Theron turned back to Ilara. He took both of her hands in his, lifting them to his lips. "He branded you to hide your light," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you were always destined to shine." He led her from the chamber of ice, which was already beginning to thaw, drops of water dripping from the ceiling like spring rain. He took her to the throne room and stood before his assembled court and guards. "Behold your queen," he announced, his voice ringing through the hall. "Not just the mate I have chosen, but the woman who saved my life and broke a curse that has plagued my family for 1,000 years. She is not the ghost wolf. She is the Sun Queen, and she has brought the dawn to this kingdom." He knelt before her then, for the second time, not in search, but in devotion. "I love you, Ilara, freely, wholly, without fear." And as the entire court knelt with their king, Ilara looked down at the man who had seen her when she was invisible, and she finally, completely, believed in her own worth. "I love you too, Theron," she whispered, her heart full. 6 months passed. Spring came to the frozen peaks of the north for the first time in centuries. Green shoots pushed their way through the thawing earth in the citadel's courtyards. Where Ilara walked, small white flowers, the winter roses of her faint scent, bloomed in her wake. The castle was no longer a place of ice and shadow, but one of life and light. She was no longer the girl who hid in corners. She was a queen, beloved by her people, respected by the court. The story of her power and the king's healing had become a legend whispered in every packland, a tale of hope and renewal. Her past was not forgotten, but it no longer defined her. It was simply the prologue to a much greater story. She stood on the balcony of their chambers, the morning sun warm on her face. The air no longer bit with frost but carried the sweet scent of pine and damp earth. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar warmth pressed against her back. Theron rested his chin on her shoulder, his hands coming to rest on her gently swelling belly. "He's kicking again," Theron murmured, a smile in his voice. It was a sound she had come to cherish, the warm, genuine rumble of his happiness. Ilara placed her hands over his. She corrected gently, is strong, like her father. He chuckled, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. She is full of light, like her mother. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains that had once been their prison and were now their sanctuary. The kingdom was thriving. The curse was gone, not just for Theron, but for the child she carried, and for all the generations that would follow. They were the start of a new line, one founded not on a pact for power, but on a love that had proven stronger than any darkness. "I spent so long in the winter, Ilara," Theron whispered, his voice full of the quiet awe that still overcame him at times. "I had forgotten what warmth felt like. I never believed I would see the spring again." She turned in his arms, her own heart overflowing. She looked into his silver eyes, once so cold and now so full of love for her, for their future. "You were the winter," she said softly, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "And I was the spring. We just had to wait for our season." He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was full of promises kept, and a future brighter than any sun that had ever risen over these mountains. She was home. She was loved. She was whole. And the cold was finally, truly, gone.